Hey guys, it's Graham. What's cracking? For the last 5 years or so, I've been reading Civil War nonfiction off and on, and I've decided to finally tackle one of the larger books on my to read list, which is a narrative of the Civil War by Shelby Foote. Right now, I have part one. I think there are at least two parts, there may be a third. These are not insignificant books in terms of their size. The first one alone in audio is 42 hours, and I'm not going to just blitz it or run through it rather quickly. I've listened to about the first 30 minutes of it. I only bumped it up to 1.5 speed because I am trying to digest this. And I'm glad that I did because I've read a couple of other books recently that have sort of primed me for this one. Today I finished Voices of the Confederacy by Samuel W. Meacham, who I've read 3 books by him now. He wrote that biography of Nathan Bedford Forrest that I really enjoyed in 2022. And then I believe I read another one by him earlier this year called It Wasn't About Slavery, which is another look at the Civil War, but through a more comprehensive lens. If you get your entire perspective on the Civil War from public education and from Reddit, and even from Shane Gillis jokes, as much as I love the guy, you could be forgiven for thinking that it was just super racism, and the North was like, we don't want you to have slaves, and the South is like, we really want to have slaves because of whatever, and chalk it up to just that. But there are enough resources out there that are easy to digest to kind of help you appreciate the complexity of the scope and what exactly finally set the South off in their secession in 1861. Slavery was definitely a component of it. Slavery absolutely had to end, but Lincoln wasn't running on abolition, and the South wasn't seceding solely because of slavery. They were seceding because they had no representation in the executive branch, and they wouldn't want to be ruled by the North, and this was really, at least from the outset, a test of the electoral system that had been set up by the founders not even 90 years prior. Think of it this way. The Revolution was still in somewhat living memory in the oldest minds of the country. They were the youngest people when it happened and when it concluded. This was still something to which they were connected. My Nana just turned 90. She was a little girl when World War II kicked off, and she was 10 when it ended. So for an event that historically is even closer to our day than the Revolution was to the Civil War, you can understand how influential this was on the politics of the day. I mean, think about how many times you hear somebody sling the term, I don't even care about what YouTube wants, Nazi around. Because supposedly that's the worst thing that you could be because of something big that happened in world history still in living memory, even though it is far in the past, and there are other things that you can call people for crying out loud. But you get it. The electoral system had been set up, and Lincoln did not win a single electoral vote in the South. Westward expansion had not quite set out yet. The United States had grown in size during the James K. Polk administration. There was still some question as to whether these new territories would be divided up into states and would then permit slavery to continue. There were forces in the South that wanted to expand the practice of slavery into these new territories and states. Jefferson Davis was among them, the man who would become the president of the Confederacy. And so this was a time of much legal uncertainty and in many ways unprecedented, even though these events went on to then echo the conflict of the Revolution a couple of generations prior. The reason I'm mentioning Voices of the Confederacy in conjunction with this narrative of the Civil War by Shelby Foote is that this book by Meacham is a really great overview of the Southern perspective of the war in terms of a boots on the ground perspective, if that makes any sense. Sorry, that didn't make any sense. Forgive me. Scratch that. It is named and dated accounts of people who were in the South, whether they were fighting or whether they were civilians, from the outset, and then you can see the tonal shift as the war drags on, and especially as the South gets poorer and poorer. The North had all the economic resources, and they especially had all of the staple crops and the industry. The South just had tobacco, cotton, slaves, and Southern grit. And they held out for a long time, but eventually their economics and their logistics chains broke apart, and that's what led to them basically having nothing to eat by the time it was all said and done. There was more to it than that, and reading this book by Meacham, who went to great lengths to collect all of these accounts and kind of curate this collection for the tenor of the book, and reading it helps you to understand the war from the South's perspective. And he shares a perspective that is often overlooked in popular discussions of it. He emphasizes the fact that the first Union officer was killed by a Confederate sniper who was black. He talks about the dynamic between slaves and their masters going to war, and those who wanted to escape versus those who were fine with carrying on. There were slaveholders who were also abolitionists, but the problem was not as easily solved as just saying, all right, I'll free all my slaves and let them go, and then, oh crap, what next? It was complicated. The fact that there was not a precedent, not a model for them to follow, was one of the complicating factors of ending slavery and ending this peculiar institution in the South. And once again, while there were free northern states, Lincoln didn't run on abolition. Lincoln was, he was out there saying, I'm not going to change anything, but the South didn't believe that he represented them. And so in the same way that the 13 colonies had declared independence from Britain, the southern states decided to secede from the Union. And this was not just a military test or an economic test, it was also a legal test. And I'm curious to read more about Shelby Foote's perspective on this, and I'm glad that I just read Samuel Meacham's book to kind of refresh my mind on the timeline of it, and just kind of be ready for this kind of literary feast that I'm about to undergo. I'm not going to go reading the book every single day. I've got other stuff that I want to read, but I want to kind of catalog the process as I work my way through it. So, Voices of the Confederacy, very good book. And as far as the first chunk of this Shelby Foote book that I've read, it reminds me of the biography of Jefferson Davis that I read. It kind of hits the bullet points of his life. How he was the 10th child in a big family. He went to West Point. He got married once. He was a widower. His first wife died after only 3 months. He got married again to a woman about half his age. The marriage wasn't always peaceful and happy. They had their speed bumps. He was in Congress. He was the Secretary of War for Franklin Pierce, and he had the necessary experience to then be elected President of the Confederacy, even though this wasn't a post that he was thrilled to have. But he's like, all right, well, we got to do this. If this is going to work, then it's going to have to be somebody, and it might as well be me. Apparently, that's what everybody else thought. But anyway, great book so far, and go check out Voices of the Confederacy, like I said, and I'll let you know how this Civil War narrative by Foote ends up playing out. That's it for now. Drive safe. See you out there.